We live in a culture where complaining is something that is commonplace. We find all kinds of reasons to complain. We complain about the weather. It's too cold, we wish it would warm up. But then when it warms up, well, I wish it would cool back off a little bit. It rains a little bit too much, I wish it would dry up. But if you go down south, you know what I hear a lot of times? I wish it would rain a little bit. If you turn on the news, we find reasons to complain about the economy or politics. And inevitably, tomorrow, there's going to be somebody complaining, or a lot of somebody's complaining about a football game. We don't know which side that's going to be yet, but somebody will. You know, human nature hasn't changed that much, because when we talk about complaining, that got the people of Israel into a lot of trouble. And that's exactly what we're going to look at tonight. We saw that in your reading this past week. We saw that kind of really come to a head as God got really tired of the complaining that Israel just kept on doing. But you know, it's not a problem that started and was really just a point in time. It was something that built, and it just continued and continued and continued. And so while part of it was in our reading from this last week, we're going to back up all the way to the book of Exodus and see where it began. And then we're going to see where it continued. And then we're going to see where it kept on continuing. And finally, we're going to see where God said, okay, I've had enough of this. And that's what you would have read this past week. And so let's start off tonight by going to Exodus chapter 14. And what we see in this section is, in Exodus chapter 14, this is during the time whenever the Israelites are leaving Egypt. They have not crossed the Red Sea yet. They've already witnessed the plagues. They've seen the power that God has. They've seen the distinction that God has made between them and the Egyptians. That the plagues affected the Egyptians, but not the Israelites. They've seen God's power displayed again and again and again. In Exodus chapter 14 and verse 11, they said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us to die in this wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And so they make reference there. We were even saying this all the way back in Egypt, so it didn't just start here. It's been going on already, by their own admission. They haven't even crossed the Red Sea yet. They've just witnessed all of these plagues. And they're already saying to Moses, "What are you doing this for?" As if Moses is really the power behind all of this in the first place. What did you bring us out here for? It would have been better for us to just remain in slavery. It would be better for us to just stay where we have no freedom. It would be better for us if we would have remained where we were. But it began early. This complaining does several things that we're going to see tonight. Number one, the complaining that we see in Israel, and as well in us sometimes, shows a lack of faith. Let's move on to Exodus chapter 15, down to beginning in verse 22. Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" 3 days after crossing the Red Sea, that tells us a little bit further up. 3 days after they've crossed the Red Sea, they complained over needing water. They've already seen the 10 plagues. They've gotten rich from plundering the Egyptians. God has given them favor in the Egyptians that they asked, and they received whatever they asked from them. They've plundered the Egyptians. They've come out of the land of Egypt. They're now free. They've crossed the Red Sea at this point now. They've seen the power of God in plague after plague after plague, when God has shown that the gods of the Egyptians were nothing over and over and over. They've walked through the Red Sea on dry land with a wall of water on each side. And now they get a few days out into the wilderness and they're wondering, did God just bring us out here to kill us by thirst? I wonder if Moses, I wonder if they really know what they're doing, leading us out here into this wilderness. They grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So the Lord provides water after Moses cried out to the Lord. In chapter 16, beginning in verse 1, they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and against Aaron in the wilderness. Here we go. It's a little bit later, but the same thing's happening again. They found another reason to complain. The sons of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat. We ate bread to the full, for you've brought us into this wilderness to kill us and this whole assembly with hunger." The next thing we read is they're now complaining that they had it better in Egypt. You know, it was better for us to be slaves rather than to be free. We had better food. We had more food. We had all of these things. But you know what they also didn't have? Freedom. But all they could think about was, wish I had a nice plate of meat to eat. They're concerned again about the physical things, so concerned with the here and now that they've lost sight of what God had miraculously done already on their behalf in getting them out of the land of Egypt, getting them across the Red Sea, removing the Egyptians who were pursuing them, giving them water whenever the waters were bitter in Marah. And now they're saying, well, what are we going to eat? Grumbling, complaining. It shows a lack of faith. Can God really take care of us? After seeing all of what He's already done in getting them into their freedom outside of slavery, outside of Egypt. The complaining shows a lack of faith. The complaining also isn't really pleasing to God. We see it starting in Exodus. But here at this point in Exodus, they come up to Mount Sinai. And that's where they receive the law, they receive all of the commandments and things. And so we fast forward over to the book of Numbers. Now to Numbers chapter 11, where we're going to pick up after they've left Sinai. And although they've been there at Sinai, although they've received the law of God, they've been there at the mountain, they know that God's been there in their midst. They know that they know that He's continuing to be with them. He's continuing to call them to be His people. Complaining doesn't really stop. In Numbers 11, beginning in verse 1, the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. When the Lord heard it, His anger was kindled. The fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. And the people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So the name of the place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned them. After leaving Mount Sinai, when they received the law, they start complaining again, and here we see that the Lord is getting a little bit tired of it. There begins to be some consequences about this complaining. The Lord is sending them the message, stop complaining, stop grumbling. You know, it reminds me, it's like a parent listening to a child continue to whine over and over and over. And after a little while, it just gets to be too much to take. If you keep on that whining, I'm going to give you a reason to whine. I'm sure some of you have heard that at some point. And here we have the Lord saying, stop all this complaining. There's consequences beginning to happen that would come across as ungrateful. their newfound freedom from Egyptian bondage, and all they can do is complain. God, you're not giving us something to drink. God, we need something to eat. God, we don't like our situation. The Lord's anger was kindled, and fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. We move on to still in the same chapter, Numbers 11 and verse 4. The rabble who were among them had greedy desires. Also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish that we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Now our appetite is gone. There's nothing to look at except this manna. We used to have meat. We used to have fish. We used to have onions. We had all of these things, and they were free. Not really. It cost you your freedom. It cost you your life. It cost you your ability to make decisions for yourself. They were enslaved. But we had melons and onions and meat. And now they're looking at this manna. We're just so tired of this manna. It doesn't taste like we want it to anymore. We don't like it. It just isn't what we want to eat anymore. Lord, I know you've given us freedom, but this manna tastes terrible. We're just tired of it. Notice the Lord's response. Verses 18 through 20. Say to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow you shall eat meat. You've wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for we were well off in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils, and it becomes loathsome to you, because you've rejected the Lord who is among you, and you have wept before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? God says, you want meat? I'm going to give you so much meat, it's going to come out of your nose. Stop all that complaining. He's going to give them more than they bargained for. If this is what you want, I'm going to give you so much of it that you're going to be tired of it. And it reminds me of a story, and before I tell you this, I'm going to preface it by saying, yes, I do have permission to share this. Whenever Pamela was growing up, her parents sold candy. And they made these arrangements, these containers. They would put the chocolate-covered malt balls in them, and they would seal them up. Well, as a small child, she realized that if you just take 1 or 2 off the top, it wouldn't be noticed. Put the lid back on. Well, of course, whenever her dad found out that her hands had been in these containers, he couldn't sell them anymore because they've been opened. Somebody's hand has been in them. And so he found all the ones that had been opened up, poured all the malt balls into one giant bowl, and said, you're going to eat all of them. It wasn't until a couple of years ago that she told me that one of them actually sounded appetizing again. God says, you want meat? I'm going to give it to you until you're sick of it. Because they've been complaining again and again and again. And this kind of comes to a head. You get over to Numbers chapter 16 and you read of Korah's rebellion. They were specifically grumbling against Aaron in the position that God had put him in as the priest. They wanted the position of the priesthood, Korah and his company. They wanted the priesthood for themselves, not the one that God had put in charge, not the one that God had chosen. They said, we want that. The earth opened up and swallowed up those who were complaining. One of the most, and I don't mean this literally, but one of the most unbelievable passages in this whole thing is in Numbers 16 and verse 41. The day after The earth has opened up and swallowed up Korah and his group of rebels. It says, the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. They haven't learned their lesson about grumbling and complaining, but notice the specific complaint. It says, you're the ones who caused the death of the Lord's people. The Lord has put an end to those who were rebelling against him, who were complaining against him, complaining against his servants. And the people came out to Moses and said, you caused this. You caused the death of these, the Lord's people. These rebels, they're calling the Lord's people. Picking up there in verse 42, it came about, however, when the congregation had assembled against Moses and Aaron, that they turned toward the tent of meeting. Behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, get away from among this congregation, that I may consume them instantly. And they fell on their faces. You see, the Lord is getting really upset with the constant complaining. The Lord says, step back, I'm just going to consume them. I'm going to take them all out. Moses said to Aaron, take your censer and put in it fire from the altar and lay incense on it. Bring it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them, for wrath has gone forth from the Lord. The plague has begun. And Aaron took it as Moses had spoken and ran into the midst of the assembly. Behold, the plague had begun among the people. So he put on the incense and made atonement for the people. And he took his stand between the dead and the living so that the plague was checked. But those who died by the plague were 14,700, besides those who died on account of Korah. Then Aaron returned to Moses at the doorway of the tent of meeting, for the plague had been checked. The Lord is being very clear that this complaining cannot continue. And then he continues in chapter 17, okay, the plague, the nation isn't consumed, the nation isn't done away with, but God says, I'm still not going to put up with the complaining, and I'm going to do something to put an end to it. Chapter 17, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and get from them a rod for each father's household, 12 rods from all their leaders according to their father's households. You shall write each name on his rod, and write Aaron's name on the rod of Levi. There is one rod for the head of each of the father's households. You shall then deposit them in the tent of meeting in front of the testimony where I meet with you. It will come about that the rod of the man whom I choose will sprout. Thus I will lessen from upon myself the grumblings of the son of Israel who are grumbling against you. God says, I'm going to do this to put an end to the complaining. I'm going to do this because I'm tired of the complaining, because I'm tired of the grumbling, because it's been going on at every step of the way. Verse 8, now on the next day Moses went into the tent of the testimony, and behold, the rod of Aaron, the house of Levi, had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms, and it bore ripe almonds. Moses then brought out all the rods from the presence of the Lord to all the sons of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. But the Lord said to Moses, put back the rod of Aaron before the testimony, to be kept as a sign against the rebels, that you may put an end to their grumblings against me, so that they will not die. The complaining showed a lack of faith. Did God bring us out here to kill us? After they'd seen all that God had done for them and getting them out of slavery. It displeased God to the point that he was ready to wipe out the whole nation. He came up with the solution of having Aaron's rod bud, specifically to get rid of the grumbling. The complaining showed a lack of faith. It didn't please God, and finally, it was counterproductive to what they should have been about. You see, it was in the midst of all of their constant complaining about God and about his chosen leaders that they chose not to trust God in going into the promised land as he commanded them. You see, here we are in Numbers chapter 17. And it was in chapters 13 and 14, right in the midst of all of this complaining, that the spies came back and brought a bad report. And the people decided, oh, no, we can't take this. We can't go into the land. The Lord brought us out here to kill us. And thus they didn't really trust him. They didn't do what he said. They didn't trust that he could bring them into the land. Their constant complaining showed their lack of faith and led ultimately to disobedience. We see a people who weren't trusting in the Lord, who weren't interested in doing what he said. They didn't know if he could be trusted because they weren't apparently paying attention to what he had done for them and leading them out of slavery. Complaining is counterproductive. But you know, it's the same for us. When we complain against the Lord, it shows a lack of faith. It doesn't please him, and it's counterproductive. Let's go to the book of Philippians. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul is writing to the church in Philippi, a church that's struggling with unity, a church where there is a lack of harmony. There are at least some in this church that are struggling to get along as you read through the letter. And notice in chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, some of the instruction that he gives is do all things without grumbling or disputing. But he doesn't just stop there. He doesn't say, stop complaining, stop grumbling, stop disputing. He gives a reason for it. The grumbling and disputing is counterproductive. It keeps us from being able to be successful in our mission. Verse 15, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation among whom you appear as lights in the world. Can we really appear as a light in the world, as the lights to the world that God's called us to be, if all we can do is complain about one another? Complain about God? Complain about how we would like something to be different? Who wants to be part of a church where the members constantly complain and fuss about one another? Well, you can find the complaining like that everywhere out in the world. There's plenty of places you can get that. God designed his church, as we saw this morning, to be a family that loves one another. If we follow Jesus, we're to be a people that love each other, and that's what identifies us as being his people. Complaining is counterproductive to that. It's the opposite of that. Who wants to follow a God if all we do is grumble about him? In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 10, Paul writes about the example of the Israelites. And he talks about a number of the things that they did that weren't right. And one of them he says in verse 10, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. He's talking there about the lesson we're to learn from the Israelites. Don't live like they did. Don't be unfaithful like they were, because it didn't work. We have to be careful what we say, be careful of what we think, because complaining won't cause anything but trouble. We see that of the Israelites, and we can see that today as well. But you know, the things that we complain about are often similar, about physical things that God has promised to take care of. We'll just trust him. You know, Jesus talks about God's provision for his people in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 down to the end of the chapter, he talks about the things that we tend to worry about. And interestingly enough, if you listen to the conversations that go on in society, the things that we tend to complain about sometimes too, the physical things. Don't be worried about your life as to what you'll eat, what you'll drink, or your body as to what you'll put on. Is not life more than food, the body more than clothing? He goes on a little further down, verse 32. The Gentiles eagerly seek all these things. Your heavenly Father knows you need all these things. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. If we seek God first, he will take care of our needs. And if you look back at history, one of the things you'll notice is that when God makes a promise, he has a pretty good track record. As a matter of fact, he keeps his word 100% of the time. When he makes a promise, we don't have to wonder whether or not he will or can. The question is really about whether or not we'll seek him first. Because when we do what he told us to do, we can absolutely trust that he will do what he said he would. There's no reason for us to complain. As a matter of fact, the opposite of complaining, the opposite of grumbling, is what Paul writes about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 18. In everything give thanks. This is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. In everything give thanks. And there's always something to be thankful for. You know, the natural tendency in a lot of situations is to complain. But, you know, if we stop for a few minutes whenever we're tempted to complain, when we're tempted to grumble, when we're tempted to be upset, and we look around, there's always something that we can be thankful for. There's always a reason that we can tell God, thank you. We can always find blessings. And when we focus on being thankful, when we start to look around at all of what God has done for us, and he's done a tremendous amount, it really helps to solve the problem of complaining. Because when I start to think about when I'm tempted to complain, and I start to think, you know, I shouldn't be doing this, and I start to look around, okay, what do I have to be thankful for? It's usually not too long before I'm thinking, why was I wanting to complain to begin with? God's given me so much. He's given us so much to be thankful for. And he really hasn't given us any reason to complain. He led the Israelites out of slavery. And there were some hardships that they faced, but they were free. They were God's people. They were God's chosen people. In Jesus Christ, he's led us out of slavery to sin. Things aren't always going to be easy in this life, but he's given us freedom. He's forgiven us. He's given us fellowship with him. He's given us hope. He's given us an inheritance in heaven that is reserved for us. He hasn't given us a reason to complain. He's given us incredible reason to be thankful. So let's focus on what he's done for us. Let's focus on what he's done, the reason he's given us to be thankful when we're tempted to complain. And tonight we're going to offer an invitation. We're going to sing an invitation song in just a moment. Maybe you find yourself tempted to complain in situations. Tonight we invite you to reassess, to think about that, and to find reasons in those situations to tell God thank you. And the biggest reason he's given us to be thankful is his Son, Jesus. You have the opportunity tonight, if you have a need of prayers, if you need to recommit yourself to him, we'll help you in any way that we can. Or tonight, if you've never obeyed the gospel, you have the opportunity to put Christ on in baptism, to have all your sins washed away. And what a reason to be thankful. If we can assist you in that tonight, would you come while we stand and while we sing?